New York City breathes differently at night. The streets hum with a kind of electricity, neon lights flicker, taxis slice through the darkness, and in the shadows between it all, there was once an underworld that moved with its own rhythm. Hidden beneath the glamour and noise, a silent empire grew, invisible to most but felt by all. And at the center of that empire stood a man whose name would become synonymous with organized crime, Charles Lucky Luciano. But this story isn't just about a criminal mastermind. It's about a strategist who reshaped the very fabric of American underworld power. To understand him, you must first absorb the atmosphere of the world he controlled. Imagine the smoke-filled backrooms of Manhattan's hottest nightclubs, where jazz bands drowned out whispered deals and fortunes were exchanged with nothing more than a nod. Picture the tremor of fear in the hearts of men who owed money to the wrong people, the push and pull of rival gangs fighting for scraps of a city that seemed infinite, and the politicians who pretended not to see. Crime wasn't random here, it had rhythm, hierarchy, and a code. But before Luciano, that code was fragmented, scattered across dozens of small-time bosses who fought more than they cooperated. The American Mafia was a beast made of too many heads. Luciano's brilliance was seeing what others couldn't. That chaos was just a raw material waiting for someone ambitious enough to mold it into something far more profitable. This documentary begins at the intersection of myth and reality. Lucky Luciano has been cast in countless roles across history: villain, hero, tyrant, innovator, traitor, savior of the American Mafia. But strip away the legends and the sensational headlines, and what remains is a man whose strategic mind rivaled that of corporate executives, political leaders, and wartime tacticians. His genius wasn't merely in committing crimes but in organizing them. He understood human nature, power dynamics, and the psychology of fear in a way that few men ever have, legitimate or otherwise. While other mobsters ruled through brutality alone, Luciano ruled through structure. He grasped what businessmen call scalability, the idea that a system, once perfected, can expand infinitely. Yet the irony of his story is that the structure he created would ultimately push him out of relevance. A king who built a kingdom too large to control. A mastermind undone not by a rival gangster but by the very forces, law enforcement, media, and public pressure, that his success awakened. But before we can reach his rise or his fall, we must locate the heartbeat of the man. Standing at 5'9", dark-eyed and sharp-jawed, Luciano carried himself with a calm confidence that unsettled people. He was charming when he needed to be, cold when circumstances demanded, and always aware of the leverage in any room. He understood weakness as currency, trust as a gamble, and reputation as armor. Every step he took was calculated. Every alliance had purpose. Every betrayal had timing. In many ways he behaved less like a street criminal and more like a chess player mapping out endgames long before moving a single piece. This opening chapter sets the tone. This is not a story of random violence or sensational headlines. It's a story of design. Of a man who looked at the chaotic, violent, fragmented world of organized crime and somehow envisioned a system where power could be negotiated instead of constantly fought over. A system where profit could grow without the constant threat of war. A system where the underworld could function with the precision of a legitimate corporation, all while remaining invisible. Still, genius alone does not make a kingpin. Luciano's rise required risk, betrayal, sacrifice, and blood. It required seeing friends become enemies and enemies become business partners. It required navigating racism, poverty, political pressure, and the brutal realities of early 20th century America. This documentary will take viewers into the heart of that transformation, from the gritty alleys of the Lower East Side to the backrooms where national criminal policies were drafted like government legislation. The significance of his story extends far beyond the Mafia. Luciano's influence ripples into modern organized crime, corporate strategy, political lobbying, and even international networks that rely on cooperation rather than centralized rule. He didn't invent organized crime, but he perfected its American form. And the echoes of his decisions still shape the darker corners of global economics today. As the city lights blur into the distance and the shadows tighten around the narrative, viewers are invited to step inside Luciano's world. A world where loyalty was currency, where silence was law, and where power didn't belong to the strongest or the richest. It belonged to the one who understood how to make chaos behave. This is the story of that man, that mind, and the empire he built. An empire crafted not through accidents or impulses, but through strategy. And as we peel back the layers of his life, one thing becomes clear. Lucky Luciano didn't just survive the underworld, he defined it. Before Lucky Luciano ever set foot into the criminal landscape he would one day dominate, America's underworld was a storm with no center. The early 1900s were a turbulent era, a time when cities swelled with immigrants chasing the promise of opportunity, while the shadows swelled with something darker. Crime existed not as an organized force but as a patchwork of street gangs, ethnic enclaves, and neighborhood tyrants who fought ruthlessly for tiny slices of territory. Each group operated like a tribe, fiercely protective, deeply suspicious, and unable to imagine cooperation beyond the limits of family or blood. New York City in particular was a battleground. Italian gangs controlled certain blocks, Jewish gangs others, Irish mobs the rest. Power shifted constantly, often overnight, driven by petty feuds, honor disputes, or impulsive acts of revenge. Violence wasn't a strategy, it was the default language. Gunfire echoed in alleyways with such regularity that the city grew numb to it. Police corruption only added fuel. Officers bought off by one gang would arrest the rivals, tipping the balance unpredictably. There were no rules, no stability, and no vision for anything bigger than immediate survival. This chaotic environment was not accidental, it was the product of desperation. Immigrants arrived with little money, few connections, and the harsh realization that opportunity was often reserved for those born on the right side of the Atlantic. For many young men, the street became both battlefield and classroom. Crime offered what legitimate society refused: respect, power, and income. But the problem was fragmentation. Every gang thought only about the next fight, the next racketeering scheme, the next show of dominance. There was no long-term planning, no economics, no shared leadership. Just endless conflict. The Sicilian Mafia, though more structured than most groups, also arrived in America disorganized. Old country traditions clashed with New World realities. In Sicily, hierarchy was sacred, loyalty unbreakable, and disputes handled quietly. But in America, ambition burned hotter. Young mobsters wanted more than tradition. They wanted wealth and influence beyond anything their ancestors had imagined. This created tension between the old guard, who clung to ancient codes, and the new generation, who saw opportunity in modernization. Into this landscape stepped men who would one day become legends: Johnny Torrio, Big Jim Colosimo, Arnold Rothstein, Meyer Lansky. Each recognized the flaws in the existing system but lacked the full framework to redesign it. Torrio believed crime needed structure. Rothstein believed crime needed business sense. Yet even they operated within a world where betrayal was constant and alliances temporary. The underworld was capable of vast profit. Prohibition would soon prove that, but as long as gangs fought among themselves, they were too distracted to capitalize on it. And then came the Castellamarese War, a brutal conflict between rival Sicilian factions that revealed just how destructive the old ways could be. Men were gunned down in daylight. Bosses vanished only to be found strangled weeks later. Alliances crumbled. Entire neighborhoods lived in fear. This war wasn't just a power struggle, it was a symptom of a deeper problem. The Mafia had no central leadership, no unified code of conduct, and no mechanism to prevent internal implosion. Every man acted for himself, and the result was bloodshed without progress. Law enforcement, though often corrupt, grew more aggressive. Newspapers sensationalized mob killings, politicians demanded crackdowns, and the public grew increasingly aware of organized crime. This pressure exposed the Mafia's vulnerability. Without unity, they were easy targets, easy to infiltrate, easy to divide, easy to destroy. To survive, something had to change. The underworld needed someone who could see beyond tradition and violence, someone who could transform randomness into strategy. This was the world awaiting Lucky Luciano. A world fractured into hundreds of small kingdoms, each ruled by men too focused on immediate threats to notice the bigger picture. A world ripe for someone with a mind capable of connecting what others saw as unrelated chaos. A world in need of a leader who understood both the psychology of criminals and the mechanics of power. The brilliance of Luciano's later achievements becomes clearer against this backdrop. He didn't simply appear as another gangster. He appeared as the answer to a problem the underworld didn't even know it had. Where others saw old rivalries and ethnic boundaries, he saw inefficiency. Where others saw tradition, he saw limitations. Where others accepted constant violence as unavoidable, he saw it as a waste of profit and manpower. The state of crime before Luciano was like an unrefined or valuable, but disorganized and scattered. Prostitution rings, gambling dens, bootlegging operations, extortion schemes, and labor rackets existed everywhere, but lacked coordination. Territory changed hands so often that no enterprise could scale. Every dollar earned risked triggering a violent confrontation. Gangs controlled streets, not markets. Bosses controlled men, not systems. There was no nation-spanning network, no standardized rules, no method to resolve disputes without bloodshed. This period represents the prelude to a revolution. It shows the absence of structure that would allow viewers to appreciate the magnitude of Luciano's vision later in the story. His genius wasn't merely in creating new systems, it was in recognizing the broken patterns around him. He understood that criminals were businessmen without strategy, soldiers without leadership, and empires without architecture. The world before Lucky Luciano was an underworld without a blueprint, a kingdom without a king, a storm without direction. And it was this tumultuous, volatile environment that shaped his destiny. Because in chaos, opportunities hide in plain sight. In fragmentation, a leader can emerge. And in a world where no one controls the rules, the one who understands them best can rise above all others. By the time Luciano was ready to leave his mark, the underworld had already built the perfect conditions for transformation. All it needed was someone capable of seeing the system it could become. That someone was already growing up on the streets, learning, observing, and waiting for his moment. He arrived in America as Salvatore Lucania, a small boy clutching the hopes of a family fleeing poverty in Sicily. The journey alone was a lesson in survival. Hundreds of immigrants pressed together in steerage, the air thick with sickness and desperation, each family whispering dreams of the new world that felt both near and impossibly distant. For young Salvatore, the voyage was a transition between two worlds, the old one defined by tradition and scarcity, and the new one defined by opportunity and danger. When the ship finally docked in New York, the skyline rose like a promise. But the streets below made their own rules. The Lower East Side became his true school. A place where languages collided, tempers flared, and survival was not guaranteed. Tenement buildings stacked families on top of each other like crates in a warehouse. Children played in alleys littered with broken glass, while vendors shouted prices in half-broken English. It was noisy, crowded, and merciless. A child growing up here learned quickly that kindness was a luxury and fear was a weakness. Salvatore understood this earlier than most. By the time he was 10, he was already finding ways to make money, shining shoes, running errands, delivering messages for men whose names kids learned not to repeat. Every job earned him more than coins, it earned him insight into power. He studied the way older boys controlled the streets. He watched how petty gang leaders extorted shopkeepers, how gamblers operated in backrooms, how neighborhood bosses navigated respect and intimidation. He saw that the men who had influence weren't always the strongest, they were the smartest. They knew when to fight, when to negotiate, and when to vanish into shadows. Salvatore absorbed these observations with a quiet intensity that would later define his approach to power. Even as a child, he was learning that control wasn't about brute force, it was about understanding what made people move, fear, or depend on you. And then came the English language, the great separator of immigrants. Many boys struggled with it, but Salvatore treated it like another tool. His accent would never disappear entirely, but his ability to switch between languages gave him an advantage. He could speak to Italians in their dialect, charm Americans in their tongue, and, most importantly, bridge gaps between groups that rarely trusted each other. This linguistic flexibility made him valuable long before he became feared. He also learned early that alliances mattered. His friendship with Meyer Lansky didn't look like much at first. Two skinny kids, one Sicilian and one Jewish, standing on a corner sharing ideas bigger than their age. But in the undercurrent of that friendship was a groundbreaking truth. They didn't care about ethnic barriers. They cared about ambition. Both boys despised the chaotic violence that defined the neighborhood gangs. They talked about money, strategy, and how pointless it was to constantly fight for scraps when bigger opportunities existed. That partnership would later become one of the most important alliances in American crime history. But the streets toughened him long before strategy took shape. School was optional, survival was mandatory. Salvatore got into fights not because he enjoyed hurting people, but because every boy eventually had to prove he could defend himself. He learned how to take pain without flinching, how to decode threats in a man's posture, how to answer disrespect with equal force. These weren't criminal lessons, they were the basic skills required to walk home without getting robbed. Yet unknowingly they were forming the psychological armor of a future kingpin. His first real taste of power came in the form of a small extortion scheme. For a few cents a week, he offered protection to smaller children on their walk to school. It wasn't violence he relied on, it was reputation. He created an image of someone who could handle problems, someone you didn't want to anger. It was crude but effective. And for the first time he felt what it meant to have influence. Not through intimidation alone, but through trust, fear, and necessity woven together. Even at 12, he understood that power wasn't something you grabbed, It was something others gave you when they believed you could manage their risks better than they could. As the years passed, Salvatore grew bolder. Teenage hustles became adolescent crimes. He gambled, sold drugs in small amounts, and worked for more experienced criminals who saw promise in his attitude. He cultivated a demeanor that balanced charm with danger, a combination that drew people and yet kept them cautious. When he stood on a street corner, people noticed him, not because he demanded attention, but because he carried himself like someone who already understood the rules of a game others were just beginning to learn. The turning point came when a botched kidnapping nearly got him killed. A rival gang attacked him, beat him brutally, and left him for dead. Most young men would have been scared into abandoning the street life. But Salvatore recovered with a new perspective. Fear was no longer an obstacle, it was a compass. He realized that dying wasn't the worst thing. Living without influence, without control, without the ability to shape your own destiny was far worse. After that, he made a silent vow. He wouldn't live like a pawn in someone else's war. If he was going to survive, he had to rise high enough that no one could ever threaten him so easily again. The boy named Salvatore Lucania did not disappear, but he transformed. He studied the underworld with sharper eyes. He made friends selectively. He calculated risks with precision far beyond his age. Ambition settled into his bones, quiet, steady, relentless. He was no longer just surviving the streets, he was preparing to outgrow them. By the time he reached adulthood, the name Salvatore faded. A new identity emerged, one that would become infamous across America. Lucky Luciano. But that transformation didn't come from a single moment of luck. It came from years of observing, adapting, and understanding the flaws of the world he grew up in. Before he ever claimed power, before he ever built an empire, he was just a street kid with sharp instincts and an unshakable belief that chaos could be reshaped into opportunity. The rise of Lucky Luciano didn't begin with crime. It began with survival, intelligence, and the quiet conviction that the world he'd been born into could be mastered if he learned its rhythm better than anyone else. The transformation from a street-smart hustler into a strategic mind didn't happen overnight. It evolved slowly, shaped by every deal Lucky Luciano witnessed, every betrayal he survived, and every mentor whose strengths, or failures, taught him what true power required. By the time he entered his 20s, Luciano was no longer merely reacting to the underworld around him. He was analyzing it. The chaos that overwhelmed most gangsters fascinated him. He studied it the way a mathematician studies equations, searching for patterns hidden behind randomness. And, piece by piece, he began constructing a blueprint for how the American underworld should function. His early alliances were not accidents. Luciano chose his friends carefully, not based on loyalty alone but on talent. He understood that intelligence came in many forms, and no single person, no matter how ambitious, could dominate New York's criminal landscape alone. Meyer Lansky, his closest friend, possessed a mind built for numbers. Where Luciano saw patterns in behavior and hierarchy, Lansky saw patterns in money, flows, risks, opportunities. Their partnership was almost scientific. Two boys from marginalized communities who rejected the boundaries their own cultures tried to impose on them. They didn't care about Sicilian purity or Jewish isolation. They cared about efficiency. Then there was Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, a man of uncontrollable fire. Siegel didn't think, he reacted, and his reactions were often violent. But he was fearless, charismatic, and unpredictable, the perfect counterweight to Luciano's calculated calm. Siegel could enter rooms where Luciano preferred not to be seen and handle threats that diplomacy alone couldn't fix. Together, the trio represented intellect, vision, and force, three pillars of power that would later reshape American organized crime. But before Luciano could build anything, he had to understand why the existing system was failing. He watched the old Mafia bosses, men like Giuseppe Morello and Joe Masuria, cling to traditions that no longer fit the reality of the new world. Their rules were rigid, their pride fragile, and their leadership rooted in fear rather than cooperation. They demanded loyalty but inspired resentment. Their inability to adapt meant their families were constantly at war, with rivals, with police, with each other. Luciano saw them the way a young general sees aging commanders on the battlefield, respected but dangerously outdated. A key moment came the first time Luciano met Arnold Rothstein, the gambling mastermind who had elevated criminal enterprise to something resembling corporate sophistication. Rothstein didn't speak like a gangster, he spoke like a businessman. He viewed illegal markets as investments, not battlegrounds. He saw judges and politicians as assets, not obstacles. His influence stretched beyond New York, touching bootlegging networks, gambling circuits, boxing rings, and Wall Street schemes. To Luciano, Rothstein represented what the future could look like, crime not driven by anger or tradition but by profit and strategy. Rothstein noticed Luciano's potential immediately. He treated him not as an errand boy but as a student. Luciano listened to every word, observing how Rothstein negotiated, how he solved crises, how he avoided unnecessary violence. Under Rothstein, Luciano learned the power of subtlety. Violence, he realized, was only valuable when it served a purpose. Fear could control a neighborhood but respect could control a city. And money, steady, systematic money, could control everything. The lesson that struck him deepest was this: power is more effective when distributed strategically than when hoarded blindly. Rothstein understood alliances, balancing competing interests and managing risk. Luciano absorbed all of it until these ideas became the foundation of his own leadership style. He also began studying people with astonishing precision. He watched their mannerisms, their insecurities, what made them talk too much, what made them loyal, what made them dangerous. He observed that some men crumbled under pressure while others thrived. He noticed that greed created leverage, that jealousy created predictable enemies, and that ambition, if guided correctly, could create invaluable allies. The street had taught him survival, but these mentors taught him systems. It wasn't long before Luciano began applying these lessons. He formed networks with Jewish, Irish, and Italian criminals, something unheard of at the time. While the old guard clung to ethnic exclusivity, Luciano saw the flaw in limiting business based on heritage. Money had no nationality. Power didn't care where a man came from. And opportunity only belonged to those bold enough to seize it. His ability to navigate multiple worlds made him uniquely powerful. Italians respected his bloodline and his toughness. Jews trusted him because of his friendship with Lansky. Politicians appreciated his discretion. Even rival gangsters sensed that Luciano was different, not driven by ego but by vision. This was the period when his strategic brilliance began to show. Instead of controlling rackets through intimidation alone, he sought to optimize them. He encouraged cooperation between gangs in the bootlegging business, pushing for standardized prices and shared transportation routes. He mediated disputes rather than fueling them. He quietly expanded influence not through conquest, but through negotiation. Every deal he brokered increased his credibility. Every conflict he solved strengthened his position. Slowly, Luciano transitioned from being a participant in the underworld to being its architect. Yet ambition always brings danger. The more influence he gained, the more the old bosses began to fear him. Men like Masuria and Maranzano observed him closely, uncertain whether he represented an asset or a threat. Luciano understood their paranoia and played the game with caution. He appeared loyal, paid tribute, attended meetings, smiled when required, but behind that smile was a mind calculating routes to power they were too blind to notice. During this period, Luciano refined one of his most important skills: patience. He learned that timing could be the difference between a successful coup and a premature assassination. He studied the movements of rival factions, the strengths of leaders, the weaknesses in their networks. He didn't simply wait for opportunity, he nurtured it, feeding it quietly until it became unavoidable. By his mid-20s he had adopted a principle that would guide his rise. If the system is broken, don't just climb it, rebuild it. He wanted an underworld where bosses shared power, where disputes were settled through councils rather than gunfire, where rules existed not to protect tradition but to secure profit. This was the early vision of what would later become the Commission, the governing body that would unify American organized crime. Luciano's strategic mind was now fully formed, shaped by hardship, sharpened by observation, and strengthened by alliances with some of the sharpest minds in the criminal world. He understood the psychology of leadership better than many men twice his age. He knew that power required stability, and stability required organization. Not the rigid, ancient hierarchy of Sicily but a new model, adaptable, collaborative, and built for modern America. The rise of Lucky Luciano was no accident, no product of fate or superstition. It was the result of a deliberate, disciplined evolution. A young man transforming raw ambition into a structured vision. When he finally stepped into the arena of high-level organized crime, he wasn't just another gangster trying to survive. He was a strategist ready to reshape the entire underworld. He had learned the rules. Now he was ready to rewrite them. Long before the gunfire of the Castellamarese War shook New York, another conflict had already begun. One far quieter, yet far more transformative. It was the clash between two philosophies, two generations, two visions for what the Mafia should be. On one side stood the old guard, Sicilian traditionalists who believed the underworld should function exactly as it had in the hills and villages of the old country. On the other side emerged young, ambitious men like Lucky Luciano, who saw America not as an extension of Sicily but as a blank canvas for reinvention. This ideological battle would shape the future of organized crime more than any single assassination ever could. The old mafia was rooted in rituals, secrecy, and an unbending hierarchy. Men like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano clung to a worldview carved centuries before, where every rule was sacred and every challenge to authority was met with swift, merciless violence. Their understanding of loyalty was absolute. You obeyed the boss even if his orders destroyed you. Decisions were made at the top, dictated downward like commandments. Innovation was seen as betrayal. Efficiency meant nothing. Profit came second to control. In their eyes, the American mafia should not adapt to the modern world, it should conquer it by forcing it into old patterns. To someone like Luciano, it was madness. America was not Sicily. The opportunities were bigger, the money flowed faster, and the competition was more diverse. Limiting operations to strict ethnic boundaries or ancient customs was like trying to run a modern business with medieval tools. But Luciano also understood the psychology behind the old guard. These men had grown up in a world where change meant danger. Their rules were their shield. Their authority came not from intelligence or strategy but from tradition and fear. To let go of those things meant losing power, and no man accustomed to absolute power ever relinquishes it willingly. Still, Luciano was cautious. He never openly challenged the old ways, not at first. He listened respectfully when Masuria lectured about omerta, the sacred code of silence. He nodded when Maranzano recited the structure of the mafia's Roman-style hierarchy. Outwardly he played the obedient soldier. But inside he was already rewriting their rules. Not because he rejected the spirit of omerta, but because he believed the old men misunderstood its purpose. Silence was meant to protect the group, not to protect the ego of a boss. Loyalty was meant to build strength, not to serve tyranny. To Luciano, loyalty without reason was blindness. Fear without purpose was inefficiency. And hierarchy without intelligence was a ticking bomb that could destroy everything. The younger generation felt the same. They had grown up in America's overcrowded slums, where hunger and ambition often outweighed nostalgia. They saw the profits of bootlegging explode during Prohibition and realized that ethnic pride was useless if it prevented business expansion. They formed friendships across racial and cultural boundaries, friendships the old guard despised. Luciano and Meyer Lansky dreamed of a criminal network where anyone capable could contribute, regardless of background. Masuria saw such ideas as blasphemy. This divide widened with every bootlegging deal that fell apart due to petty rivalries and every street fight triggered by outdated customs. Luciano grew more convinced that the Sicilian-style dictatorship had no future in America. It was too rigid, too emotional, too tied to personal honor. American crime needed structure, yes, but not the suffocating structure of the old Italian clans. It needed a hybrid system, one that combined discipline with flexibility, tradition with innovation, hierarchy with cooperation. The tension between the two worlds often felt like a storm waiting to break. The old guard dismissed Luciano's generation as disrespectful modernists. The young dismissed the bosses as relics. Every meeting, every shared dinner, every whispered conversation between factions reflected this silent war. Luciano understood that overt rebellion would get him killed. So he studied the leaders instead, how they thought, how they reacted, what weaknesses they hid beneath their powerful facades. Masuria was impulsive and proud, a man who saw betrayal everywhere. Maranzano was more refined but consumed by paranoia, constructing elaborate hierarchies and demanding worship instead of respect. Both believed they were irreplaceable. Both failed to see that by clinging to outdated power structures, they were slowly choking the very empire they claimed to protect. Luciano recognized their fatal flaw. They knew how to rule men but not how to lead an organization. The code of omerta, once a symbol of unity, was being used as a weapon to silence dissent. Tradition, once a foundation for order, had become a prison preventing progress. And the young men who saw the future coming, the Lansky types, the Siegel types, realized they needed a leader who could blend the lessons of the past with the demands of the present. Luciano did not seek that role at first. But leadership finds those who can see patterns others overlook. As tensions escalated and factions sharpened their knives, Luciano understood that the moment for choosing sides would eventually arrive. But his fight wouldn't be against the men themselves, it would be against their ideas. Against a system that turned opportunity into chaos and innovation into treason. He respected the old guard's courage, their resilience, their devotion to principles. But he refused to let those principles destroy the possibilities of a new era. The line between tradition and evolution had been drawn. One path led to stagnation, endless wars and eventual collapse. The other led to an organized future where crime operated like a corporation, not a feudal kingdom. And as Luciano stood at the crossroads of these two worlds, he made the only choice that fit his vision. The old guard would either adapt, or be removed. But before anything could change, Luciano needed to survive the storms that were coming. And he needed to persuade others that the Mafia's future depended not on harder fists, but sharper minds. The conflict between the code of the past and the strategy of the future was no longer avoidable. It was inevitable. And Lucky Luciano was preparing to win it. Power never changes hands peacefully, not in politics, not in business, and certainly not in the criminal underworld. The old Mafia order was collapsing under its own inflexibility, but it would not simply step aside for a new vision. Lucky Luciano knew that if he wanted to build an empire rooted in strategy instead of chaos, he had to dismantle the existing one with precision. And this required something more dangerous than violence. It required patience, manipulation, and the ability to turn enemies into stepping stones. His ascent began with subtle moves. Luciano inserted himself into every profitable racket he could, bootlegging, narcotics, gambling, labor unions, making himself indispensable to various factions. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a broker, a mediator, a man who could walk into a room of rival gang leaders and convince them to calm their tempers long enough to finish a deal. Even the old guard, who distrusted his modern ideas, relied on him because his involvement reduced conflict and increased profit. He made himself the hinge on which the underworld turned. But he also understood that money alone couldn't topple ancient power. The real obstacle was the Castellammarese War, an eruption of violence between Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, two titans of the old world clinging to dominance. Their feud was more than a personal struggle. It was the embodiment of everything Luciano despised about the outdated Mafia structure. Backroom meetings turned into executions. Alliances shifted by the week. New York streets became rivers of blood as gang after gang was dragged into the conflict. Luciano watched as the old guard waged a war that made them weaker with every shot fired. He did not choose sides. Instead, he chose timing. He maintained a facade of loyalty, first to Masuria, then cautiously to Maranzano when circumstances changed. Each leader believed Luciano was his secret weapon, his young protégé destined to continue the old traditions. But Luciano had no interest in celebrating the past. He was busy designing the future. He realized that both bosses were too blinded by ego to understand that the war itself was killing them. And so he played a long game, one where both Masuria and Maranzano would fall, clearing the path for a new kind of leadership. The war reached its peak when bootlegging operations were disrupted, union rackets crumbled, and profits dwindled to a fraction of their potential. To the old guard, these losses were unfortunate. To Luciano, they were proof. Proof that the system was broken. Proof that disorganization cost more than cooperation. Proof that in order to build a true empire, the era of dictators had to end. But removing tyrants requires more than ambition. It requires alliances. Behind closed doors, Luciano met with Lansky, Siegel, Frank Costello, and other trusted associates who shared his vision. They discussed restructuring the Mafia like a corporation, dividing territories and profits through negotiation instead of bullets. They envisioned a national network where every boss had a seat at the table but no single man controlled everything. These conversations were radical, almost treasonous. But they represented the blueprint of what organized crime could become. When the time came, Luciano made his move against Masuria. It was not an act of betrayal in his eyes, it was an act of necessity. Masuria had become a liability, dragging the Mafia deeper into instability. Luciano arranged a meeting, acted as if he were submitting to Masuria's demands, and then orchestrated the legendary ambush that ended Masuria's reign. The operation was swift, clinical, almost surgical, the work of men who were no longer street thugs but strategic operatives. But the war didn't end there. Maranzano, freed from his rival, declared himself the boss of bosses, a title that enraged Luciano. To Maranzano, hierarchy was everything. To Luciano, it was a trap. A single supreme leader made the entire system vulnerable. If the top man fell, the entire structure collapsed. That was the problem with dictatorships. And Maranzano, in his arrogance, failed to see that his attempt to recreate Sicilian feudalism in America placed a target on his back. Luciano tolerated the charade only long enough to prepare the next step. When Maranzano ordered his assassination, Luciano acted first. Using out-of-town Jewish hitmen unfamiliar to the Italian community, he ensured the attack would bypass Maranzano's security. Within minutes, the old boss was gone, removed not by emotional impulse but by calculated necessity. With the old guard eliminated, Luciano finally had the space to implement his long-envisioned plan. What followed was not chaos but order, strict, structured, deliberate order. He began by reorganizing the 5 families, not as personal kingdoms but as equal components of a larger machine. Each family would run its territory, but no one man would dominate the entire city. Luciano also established rules to prevent unnecessary violence, promote profit sharing and settle disputes through councils instead of street vendettas. For the first time in Mafia history, the concept of democracy, distorted, criminal but functional, entered the underworld. But his greatest innovation was the creation of a national crime syndicate. He saw that New York was just one city. Chicago, Buffalo, Cleveland, Detroit, New Orleans, Los Angeles, all had their own bosses, their own strengths, their own networks. Why should they be rivals when they could be partners? Luciano proposed the revolutionary idea of a commission, a governing board that included leaders from multiple families and multiple cities. Together, they would vote on major decisions, manage conflicts, and ensure stability across the entire country. This wasn't a gang anymore. It was a corporation. It was an empire built on cooperation and controlled chaos. The brilliance of Luciano's strategy lay in its balance. He didn't eliminate chaos, he organized it. He didn't end crime, he industrialized it. By giving every boss a stake in the system, he reduced the incentive for violent coups. By spreading power across many hands, he ensured no single point of failure. His empire couldn't be toppled by a single assassination or arrest. It was resilient, diversified, scalable. And this was the genius that set Luciano apart from every gangster before him. Where others saw enemies, he saw potential partners. Where others saw boundaries, he saw networks. Where others sought absolute authority, he sought controlled distribution of power. He created a structure where conflict was contained, where ambition was channeled productively, and where the Mafia could expand without collapsing under its own weight. The true turning point wasn't the killings themselves, it was the shift from violence-driven leadership to strategy-driven organization. Luciano understood that the most powerful man in the room isn't the one who shouts the loudest or kills the quickest. It's the man who can convince the rest that his vision serves their interests too. And by the time his plan was complete, he was no longer just another mobster. He was the architect of a new underworld, one that would shape American crime for generations. Lucky Luciano had built his empire. Now he would rule it. Once the smoke of the Castellammarese war settled and the old guard lay buried beneath their own outdated ambitions, Lucky Luciano faced a question that would determine the future of American organized crime. How do you maintain power in a world built on mistrust? Violence could keep men afraid, but fear alone could not sustain an empire. Luciano understood that the Mafia's chaos did not come from lack of strength, it came from lack of structure. And so he began assembling something unprecedented in the criminal world, a government for gangsters. The creation of the commission was not born from ideology but from necessity. Luciano had witnessed firsthand that dictatorships in the underworld always collapsed. A single boss at the top meant a single target for rivals, law enforcement, or internal betrayal. If the entire system relied on one man, then the entire system was fragile. He wanted something impossible to topple. Something that could survive even if he disappeared. The answer was shared power. He called together leaders from the newly reorganized 5 families and extended invitations to influential mob bosses across the country. Men from Chicago, Buffalo, Cleveland, and Detroit were summoned, not as subordinates but as equals. For the first time, criminals who previously saw each other as competition sat at the same table with the understanding that cooperation meant greater profit for everyone. The room where they gathered crackled with tension and curiosity. These were men who built their lives on suspicion, men who rarely trusted the person sitting beside them. Yet Luciano managed to command the room with a calm authority that made even the most hardened bosses pause and listen. He explained the commission as if he were unveiling a new form of government, one where disputes would be settled by majority vote, where territory was respected, and where wars would no longer erupt over petty slights or ego-driven feuds. Every decision of national significance would pass through the commission, not through a single boss. The brilliance of his vision was simple: give every powerful man a stake in stability, and none would want to destabilize it. But this new era of cooperation required more than structure. It required diplomacy. Luciano became the unofficial mediator, the glue between powerful men who barely tolerated one another. He used his charm strategically, creating personal relationships that softened political tensions. He understood how to read a man's pride, how to manipulate grudges into compromises, and how to turn rivals into reluctant partners. His leadership style was subtle, almost invisible. He was not ruling as a tyrant, but orchestrating as a strategist. Even when others believed they were acting independently, Luciano was often the unseen hand guiding them. Through the commission he also redefined how families interacted. Instead of rigid, feudal dominance, power was now balanced. Each family controlled its own territory and business operations, but none could launch major actions without wider approval. Assassinations of bosses, expansion into new cities, or disputes over lucrative rackets all required permission. This was unheard of in the Mafia world. Men who once killed first and negotiated later now had to present cases like businessmen at a board meeting. But the genius of Luciano's system was that it didn't eliminate chaos, it managed it. Rivalries still existed but they were redirected. Competition still burned but it was controlled. Violence still happened but only when sanctioned. Luciano had taken the uncontrollable energy that once tore the Mafia apart and reshaped it into a force that propelled the entire organization forward. Of course, not all alliances were based on logic alone. Some were built on personal respect. Luciano's relationship with Frank Costello, for example, was rooted in mutual understanding. Costello, known as the Prime Minister, excelled in political influence and union manipulation. While others braced for gunfights, Costello secured judges, police captains and politicians. Luciano knew that power wasn't only built in back alleys, it was built in city halls. Their partnership elevated the Mafia from street-level crime to national influence. Then there was the delicate relationship with Al Capone's Chicago outfit. Capone was a figure of immense strength but unpredictable violence, an empire unto himself. Luciano approached the Chicago bosses with diplomacy rather than challenge, ensuring that New York and Chicago operated in harmony instead of rivalry. He understood that any war with Chicago would devastate both sides and draw federal scrutiny. Instead, he offered cooperation, profit-sharing, and mutual respect. The outfit accepted, and the Mafia gained stability across two of America's most powerful cities. Yet alliances could not erase tension entirely. Luciano constantly navigated the dangers of ambition among his peers. Some bosses wanted more power than their territories allowed. Others distrusted the new system and longed for the absolute control of the old days. Luciano answered these challenges with negotiation when possible and decisive action when necessary. He avoided unnecessary bloodshed, but he never hesitated to remove threats to the commission's stability. His priority was always the structure, not his ego. Behind the commission's polished veneer of order, an unspoken truth existed. Luciano was the quiet leader of this new world. He didn't hold an official title. He didn't declare himself the boss of bosses. He didn't demand tribute or public acknowledgement. His power came from influence, not intimidation. When he spoke, the room listened, not because he forced them to, but because his vision benefited everyone. He was the architect who made the Mafia profitable, disciplined, and nearly untouchable. But stability often creates its own dangers. By unifying crime, Luciano made the organization more visible. By reducing violence, he made it easier for law enforcement to concentrate its investigative resources. The alliances he built brought wealth and order, but they also created a target, a centralized structure that the authorities would one day attempt to dismantle. For now, though, Luciano's reimagined underworld thrived. It was a machine running with precision, generating millions of dollars across multiple states. Illegal gambling expanded. Bootlegging operations became streamlined. Racketeering took on a corporate-like efficiency. The Mafia no longer resembled street gangs. It resembled a nationwide conglomerate. And at the center of this empire was a man who understood better than anyone that power was not about domination, it was about coordination. He had turned rivals into allies, enemies into partners, and chaos into opportunity. The commission was not merely an innovation, it was the fulfillment of Luciano's belief that organized crime could function not as a battlefield, but as a business. He had built the most efficient criminal organization America had ever seen. And yet, even as the empire reached its peak, forces outside his control were beginning to turn their gaze toward him. For every empire that rises, a fall eventually follows. But for now, Lucky Luciano stood at the height of his creation, surrounded by allies, supported by structure, and protected by the order he had imposed on chaos. Even as Lucky Luciano's empire appeared flawless from the outside, smooth, efficient, and unified beneath the structure of the commission, another war simmered beneath the surface. A war that didn't roar with gunfire or erupt in public bloodshed, but one that moved silently through backrooms, informant whispers and political calculations. It was the hidden war, the slow and relentless tightening of pressure from forces Luciano couldn't negotiate with. The government, the media, and the rising tide of public outrage. It was a war fought in shadows, where information became ammunition and patience became a weapon. For years, the Mafia had thrived behind a veil of denial. Even as criminal profits soared into the millions, authorities publicly dismissed the idea of a centralized organization. They believed crime was a scattered mess of small gangs, lacking coordination. Luciano exploited that ignorance masterfully. But the very efficiency he brought to the underworld, the networks, the cooperation, the reduced violence, made the Mafia too organized, too profitable, too large to remain invisible forever. Law enforcement's ears perked up not because of street murders but because of money. Bootlegging had flooded federal offices with reports of suspicious transactions. Labor racketeering created patterns too consistent to ignore. Gambling networks stretched across states like arteries feeding the same criminal heart. Detectives began to see what Luciano already knew: when chaos is removed, patterns emerge. And patterns attract attention. The first real threat didn't come from a rival boss. It came from a prosecutor named Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey was ambitious, relentless, and determined to make a name for himself. He didn't just want to arrest criminals, he wanted to dismantle the entire structure behind them. Unlike his predecessors, Dewey believed organized crime was real, national, and led by someone with intelligence far beyond the typical gangster. He didn't have proof, but he had a suspicion. And sometimes in a hidden war, suspicion is enough to mobilize an army. Luciano watched this rising threat with a mix of irritation and fascination. He had always known the government was the one enemy he couldn't kill or negotiate with. But he underestimated Dewey. To Luciano, prosecutors came and went. Politicians were bought. Judges could be influenced. Police could be paid. But Dewey wasn't motivated by bribes or fear. He wanted legacy. He wanted headlines. And eventually, he wanted Luciano's name carved into the trophy case of his political career. Still, Luciano believed the commission structure would shield him. He rarely left paper trails. He avoided direct involvement in violent acts. He operated through buffers, men who took orders, passed messages, and handled illicit details. To the outside world, Luciano appeared almost disengaged, a man who spent his nights in high-end nightclubs and luxury suites rather than dingy criminal hideouts. This distance made him look less like a mob boss and more like a wealthy socialite with questionable friends. But the hidden war was no longer confined to New York. Federal agencies began coordinating information. State-level investigators shared intel. Newspapers ran sensational stories about vice, corruption, and prostitution rings. Each article added pressure. Each rumor gave prosecutors leverage. Luciano's empire was built on the assumption that the public would remain unaware of how criminal networks operated. But ignorance was fading, replaced by fear and outrage. The hidden war also brewed internally. Not every mobster appreciated the commission's democratic structure. Some missed the old days of unilateral authority, where a boss didn't need permission to eliminate threats. Others envied Luciano's power, believing he had become too influential, too indispensable. A few whispered that he had grown arrogant, too confident in his political connections, too trusting in the system he built. These whispers were dangerous. In the underworld, fear keeps men loyal, but stability gives them ideas. Ideas that Luciano might not always be the one in charge. And then there were the women. Prostitution rackets, once handled quietly, grew so profitable that they became a primary target for investigations. Women arrested in raids often cooperated with police more readily than hardened gangsters. Their testimonies created a trail prosecutors could follow, linking brothels to intermediaries, intermediaries to family associates, and eventually, slowly but unmistakably, to Luciano himself. He always believed he was insulated, but the hidden war made one truth painfully clear. No matter how carefully he positioned himself, someone beneath him could break. Still, Luciano remained calm. His genius had always been his ability to anticipate moves before others even recognized the game unfolding. He strengthened alliances, tightened operations, and reassured his closest men that Dewey was nothing more than another nuisance. He believed the commission would protect him, that the structure was secure. But what he didn't anticipate was how much the external world had changed. This was no longer the era of small-time corruption and easily bought officials. America was shifting. The public demanded order. Politicians needed victories. Newspapers needed villains. and prosecutors needed a face, a mastermind, to represent the entire criminal empire. Luciano was perfect for the role. Intelligent, charismatic, influential, and tied, at least indirectly, to every major racket in New York. The hidden war escalated in silence. Surveillance increased. Informants multiplied. Investigations expanded. Slowly, Dewey built a case, not against the Mafia as a concept but against Luciano as a symbol. He didn't need proof of every crime. He just needed proof of enough crimes. The rest could be inferred through narrative. And Dewey was a master storyteller. Luciano's empire was still strong, profitable, and respected. But beneath that stability, cracks formed. Some were political, some operational, some psychological. Pressure has a way of exposing vulnerabilities even the strongest leaders didn't know they had. By the time Luciano realized how serious the threat truly was, the hidden war had already shifted into open confrontation. The carefully constructed distance he kept from criminal acts would soon be tested in a courtroom where strategy mattered less than perception. For the first time in years, the man who controlled an empire felt something he hadn't felt since his youth on the streets, the sense that someone else was now dictating the pace of the game. The hidden war had become unavoidable, and it was only the beginning of the storm that would ultimately bring him down. The fall of a kingpin never begins with a single event. It begins with tiny fractures, hairline cracks in the foundation that go unnoticed until pressure turns them into chasms. For Lucky Luciano, the beginning of his downfall did not arrive with sirens or handcuffs. It arrived quietly through whispers, betrayals, and the slow erosion of the invisible armor he believed protected him. The man who built an empire on structure and foresight was about to face the one enemy he had never truly learned to control: inevitability. The hidden war that prosecutors had been waging against him was tightening. Thomas E. Dewey's relentless pursuit had drawn blood, not from Luciano himself, but from his organization. Raids increased. Associates were arrested. Women involved in the prostitution networks were questioned so aggressively that many broke. Newspapers printed their confessions in bold headlines, portraying Luciano as the mastermind behind a sprawling vice empire that exploited hundreds. Whether these claims were exaggerated hardly mattered. The public wanted a villain and Dewey wanted a victory. Luciano was becoming both. For years, Luciano had believed that the buffers he built, layers of intermediaries between him and the illegal operations, would protect him from prosecution. He had structured the organization precisely so that his hands never touched the dirt. But under pressure, buffers buckle. Men who once swore loyalty wavered. Some disappeared. Others whispered to investigators. A few simply said the wrong thing to the wrong person. And every leak, no matter how small, began to form a trail. What once made Luciano untouchable, his vast influence, was now the very thing being used against him. Prosecutors argued that no criminal operation in New York could function at such a massive scale without his approval. They didn't need evidence showing him issuing orders. They just needed evidence showing the organization existed. From there, the narrative wrote itself. Inside the Mafia, tensions grew. Some bosses quietly questioned whether Luciano's arrest might benefit them. Others felt that Dewey wouldn't stop until Luciano was removed, one way or another. Fear spread through the ranks, not fear of Luciano but fear of association with him. And in the underworld, distance is a form of betrayal. Meanwhile, Luciano began sensing shifts in tone from men he had once trusted. Meetings felt tense. Conversations seemed rehearsed. Allies who once spoke freely now chose their words with caution. He had built the commission to distribute responsibility, but distribution also meant dispersing loyalty. No one man was indispensable anymore, not even him. Still, Luciano refused to believe he was losing control. He moved through the nightlife of New York with the same calm swagger as always. He visited clubs, met with associates, and acted as though everything was under control. But beneath the surface he was calculating. He knew Dewey had momentum. He knew the newspapers had turned him into the face of organized crime. And he knew that fear among his own men could make them unpredictable. Yet what Luciano didn't expect was betrayal from someone he had trusted for years. The informant who eventually gave Dewey the confidence to pursue Luciano aggressively wasn't a high-ranking mobster. It was someone smaller, someone scared, someone who believed that cooperating with law enforcement might be their only way out. The details were murky. Motivations mixed. Fear, revenge, desperation. But the result was clear. Dewey now had enough to move. Luciano wasn't arrested in a dramatic police standoff. He was taken quietly, unexpectedly, in the middle of the night while staying at a hotel in Arkansas. The news hit New York like a thunderclap. The newspapers erupted. Headlines painted him as the king of organized vice. Politicians praised Dewey. The public celebrated. At last, the man behind the shadowy networks had been caught. But the true threat wasn't the arrest. It was the trial that followed. For the first time, Luciano was forced to confront a world he couldn't control through charm or intimidation. Courtrooms weren't backrooms. Judges didn't negotiate like bosses. Jurors couldn't be bribed or threatened. Here, the rules were written by men who saw him not as a strategic mastermind but as a criminal dismantling society. The narrative Dewey constructed was designed not to question Luciano's guilt but to assume it. Luciano's lawyers protested. They argued he had never personally run brothels. They pointed out inconsistencies in testimonies. They highlighted the lack of direct evidence. But the prosecution had something stronger than facts. They had a story. A story of a powerful mob boss using fear, violence, and manipulation to control a multi-million-dollar prostitution empire. The public believed it. The jurors believed it. Even some of Luciano's associates began to believe it. As the trial progressed, Luciano felt the walls closing in. This wasn't a fight among gangsters. This was a political war, a battle between a rising prosecutor and a criminal empire that represented everything wrong with the city. And in this battle, Luciano realized something he had never admitted before. He wasn't in control. Then came the moment that sealed his fate. A verdict delivered with chilling finality. Guilty. 30 to 50 years in state prison. The empire builder who once shaped the underworld with invisible hands would now live behind steel bars. The fall did not come from a rival boss or a bullet in the night. It came from a courtroom, from public opinion, from a government determined to claim victory. Luciano's genius had always been his ability to anticipate danger. But this time, the danger came from a world he had underestimated, the world above the streets he once ruled. The man who built order out of chaos was now engulfed by a storm he couldn't redirect. This was not yet the end of his influence. But it was the beginning of the end of his reign. The courtroom became a theater, and Lucky Luciano, once the most powerful man in the American underworld, found himself cast as the villain in a production he could no longer direct. The trial was not simply about evidence. It was about image, politics, and public hunger for justice. Thomas E. Dewey understood this better than anyone. He wasn't just prosecuting Luciano, he was building a legacy, and every newspaper headline, every radio broadcast, every scandalous testimony was a brick in the monument he intended to erect on the ruins of Luciano's empire. For the first time, Luciano had no control over the narrative. In the streets, he could silence witnesses. In the clubs, he could charm opponents. Inside the Mafia, he could negotiate or eliminate problems. But in the courtroom, he was stripped of all that. He wore a suit instead of power. He sat at a wooden table instead of a corner booth surrounded by loyal soldiers. The law reduced him from kingpin to defendant, from strategist to accused criminal waiting for strangers to decide his fate. The prosecution opened with a scorched earth approach. Dewey presented Luciano not as a businessman or even a mobster, but as the architect of a vast sexual exploitation machine. Witness after witness described a network that painted Luciano as omnipresent, a shadow pulling strings from luxury hotels, collecting profits from brothels, punishing disobedience with violence. The testimonies blurred truth with fear, fact with pressure. Some witnesses were coerced. Others were coached. Many were too frightened to resist Dewey's aggressive questioning. But the details didn't matter. The story did. The public devoured the spectacle. Newspaper stands filled with sensational headlines. Journalists portrayed Luciano as a monster in tailored suits, a man who corrupted innocent women and built an empire on degradation. They didn't mention that many testimonies were inconsistent. They didn't mention the lack of direct evidence. They didn't mention the political pressure behind the scenes. The narrative was clearer, cleaner, and far more compelling when Luciano was framed as the singular evil behind a sprawling criminal machine. Luciano watched this unfold with a tight jaw but controlled expression. He had faced guns, betrayals, and wars without flinching. But this was different. The courtroom was the one battlefield where he could not fire back. He could only listen as prosecutors dissected his life, twisted his relationships, and attributed crimes to him he may have never personally committed. He saw jurors shift uncomfortably, heard gasps ripple through the gallery, and realized that reason was no longer part of the equation. Emotion ruled here. Outrage ruled here. And Dewey knew how to exploit both with surgical precision. His defense team tried to counter the tidal wave. They argued that Luciano didn't need prostitution as a revenue stream. His legitimate gambling and business fronts already made him wealthy. They highlighted contradictions in the testimonies, exposed the motivations of witnesses seeking leniency, and emphasized that Luciano never signed documents or gave orders that connected him directly to brothel operations. But Dewey wasn't fighting for truth, he was fighting for victory. And in this war, perception was his most powerful weapon. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily. Protesters demanded justice. Reporters shouted questions as Luciano was escorted into the building. Flashbulbs exploded around him like bursts of gunfire. To the public, he wasn't Lucky Luciano anymore. He was America's symbolic enemy, the living embodiment of corruption and vice. Dewey had successfully crafted the image. Luciano as the mastermind, the devil of the underworld, finally dragged into the light. Inside the courtroom, the tension was suffocating. Every testimony tightened the noose. Every cross-examination barely loosened it. And Luciano could sense his empire weakening beyond those walls. Associates grew distant. Politicians who once shook his hand now avoided his name. Friends became observers. Allies became liabilities. He was no longer the unstoppable force of the commission. He was a captive, fighting alone. The climax of the trial came when Dewey delivered a closing argument so precise, so calculated, that even the judge seemed compelled. Dewey spoke not of law but of morality. Not of evidence but of responsibility. He argued that even if Luciano never personally set foot in a brothel, the entire criminal system could not exist without his approval. He painted Luciano as the brain, the architect, the hidden ruler. It was a masterclass in rhetoric, and the jury absorbed every word. Luciano's expression remained still, but internally he understood the shift. That speech had sealed him in the public mind. Not as a businessman. Not as a negotiator. But as a tyrant. When the jury finally returned, silence fell over the courtroom like a shroud. The foreman's voice was calm, almost gentle as he read the verdict. Guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. Luciano did not flinch. The press would later describe his reaction as cold, even arrogant. But those who knew him understood it was the expression of a man refusing to give his enemies the satisfaction of fear. Inside he calculated outcomes. He thought of appeals, of political connections, of options that might still remain. But then the judge spoke the sentence: 30 to 50 years in state prison. Not even Luciano's iron composure could hide the weight of that blow. The courtroom erupted, some in applause, some in shock, some in outrage. Dewey became an instant national hero. The newspapers celebrated him as the man who finally brought down the king of organized crime. And Luciano, the strategist who thought in decades and built systems meant to outlast him, found himself escorted away in handcuffs, the cameras capturing each step as proof that even emperors could be broken. But this was not the end of his influence. Not yet. Prison would not silence him. The underworld would not forget him. And even the government would soon discover that Luciano's mind was a weapon too valuable to discard. For now, though, the Kingpin had fallen. And the world watched, believing the story was finished. They had no idea that Luciano's story was only entering its next act. Prison was supposed to be the end. A 30 to 50-year sentence meant that the man who once commanded an empire from penthouse suites and velvet-lined backrooms would now spend the rest of his life behind steel bars. But Lucky Luciano was not like other men. Power, for him, was never about location, it was about influence. And influence does not vanish simply because a door slams shut behind you. The moment Luciano arrived at Dannemora, one of New York's harshest penitentiaries, he realized that prison operated by the same laws as the streets: strength, reputation, and control. Even among convicts, his name traveled faster than he could walk through the intake corridor. Some inmates feared him. Others admired him. A few wanted to test him. But Luciano did not behave like a fallen king. He behaved like a man taking inventory of a new territory. Where most saw confinement, he saw opportunity. He observed the guards, the routines, the black markets that existed even inside prison walls. He noticed the subtle alliances between inmates, the ones who traded favors, the ones who manipulated power from the shadows. He recognized the familiar hierarchy, the stronger preying on the weaker, the cunning outmaneuvering the impulsive. It was, in essence, a miniature version of the world he once ruled. It didn't take long for Luciano's influence to seep through the cracks. He settled disputes. He mediated conflicts. He eased tensions among rival inmate groups who were constantly 2 steps from open violence. Even guards began to notice that problems stopped when Luciano spoke, and fights broke out when he was ignored. In time they learned that he was not just another prisoner, he was a stabilizer. And stability, even in prison, has value. Luciano never bragged about his influence. He didn't need to. Men came to him because he offered something no one else could: clarity. He listened, he advised, he strategized. His reputation transformed him into a kind of informal counselor, a man whose word carried weight even when he had nothing material to offer. Some inmates respected him out of fear, but most respected him out of recognition. He had lived the life they glorified, but with far greater mastery. Still, prison forced Luciano into introspection. For the first time since his youth, he had no empire to manage, no meetings to orchestrate, no enemies to outmaneuver. The silence of his cell became an unexpected mirror. He thought about the choices that brought him here, not with regret but with curiosity. He examined the architecture of his life, the alliances, the wars, the betrayals, the ambitions. He understood why the government targeted him. He understood how he had underestimated Dewey. And slowly he began to consider that his greatest strength, organization, might also be his most valuable offering to the world beyond the prison walls. This realization became critical during World War II. As the United States became entangled in global conflict, the government faced a dire problem. German submarines were sinking American ships near the East Coast. Sabotage fears spread across ports. Dock workers were uncooperative, security was weak, and investigators whispered about infiltrators. The Navy needed help from someone with influence over the people who controlled the docks. They needed the Mafia. And the Mafia's leadership, even in absence, was still Luciano. When government officials quietly approached him, the irony was undeniable. The man branded as a national menace was now being asked to help protect the nation. Luciano agreed, not because he felt patriotism but because he saw leverage. He ensured that Mafia-controlled dock workers cooperated with authorities, maintained order, and provided intelligence on suspicious activity. In return, he expected consideration, leniency, reduction, perhaps eventual release. The government never publicly admitted the extent of the arrangement. But behind closed doors they acknowledged the truth. Luciano helped keep the port secure during a critical phase of the war. Inside prison, this elevated him once again. Guards treated him differently. Officials visited him. Word spread among inmates that Luciano was not simply a prisoner. He was a man whose name still carried weight even in Washington. Yet Luciano did not flaunt this influence. He simply waited. And his patience was rewarded. After more than a decade behind bars, the state granted him commutation. The caveat was exile, deportation to Italy, never to return to the United States. The Mafia world saw this as proof. Even when caged, Luciano was a man who could bend institutions to his will. But prison had changed him in subtle ways. He had tasted vulnerability for the first time since childhood. He had learned that even the most powerful structure could collapse if pressure was applied from the right angle. He had learned that influence could survive without visibility. And he had learned that the government was willing to negotiate when frightened enough. Behind bars, the Kingpin had not disappeared. He had evolved. When the gates finally opened for him, it wasn't the triumphant return of a crime boss. It was the quiet release of a man who had been humbled by confinement but strengthened by perspective. The world outside had shifted. His empire had continued without him. New leaders had emerged. The criminal landscape was changing. But as he stepped out of prison and toward deportation, one thing was clear. Lucky Luciano was not done shaping the world. He had lost his throne but not his mind. And the final chapters of his life, filled with exile, nostalgia, attempts at relevance, and the heavy shadow of the empire he built, were just beginning. When Lucky Luciano stepped off the ship that carried him to Italy, he felt the weight of a truth he could not escape. He was returning to a place he no longer belonged to. Sicily was his birthplace, but America had shaped him. The streets of New York had forged his identity, his alliances, his empire. Now he was a man without a country, rejected by the nation he helped build in the underworld, and a stranger to the one that claimed him by blood. Exile is a strange punishment. It does not break a man with violence or confinement. It breaks him with silence. Luciano found himself walking through old Italian neighborhoods where nobody knew his name, nobody feared his influence, nobody cared about the empire he once commanded. The languages were familiar, but the rhythm of life felt slow, almost stagnant compared to the electric pulse of New York City. He had been cut from the world he shaped, and the world had not paused in his absence. Still, Luciano tried to adapt. His instincts pushed him to rebuild, to find relevance, to regain a position that mirrored his former power. In Naples, he attempted to establish networks, gambling operations, black market deals, narcotics pipelines. But he quickly discovered that the underworld in post-war Italy was not his to reclaim. Local bosses saw him not as a leader but as an outsider, a man whose reputation came from a foreign land. His fame brought him admiration from some, suspicion from others, and restrictive surveillance from Italian authorities who feared he might revive the Mafia's influence on an international scale. Meanwhile, the world of organized crime had evolved. In America, the commission still existed, but Luciano no longer had a seat at the table. Men he once mentored had become leaders in their own right. Decisions were made without him, alliances formed without him, wars resolved without his voice. The very system he created, a shared structure designed to survive the fall of any one man, was proving its effectiveness. Even his departure had not shaken it. And that was both the triumph of his vision and the quiet tragedy of his life. He had built something meant to endure. But in doing so, he had built something that no longer needed him. Loneliness crept in like a slow tide. Luciano found himself recalling the golden years, the smoke-filled backrooms, the sharp minds of Lansky and Costello, the laughter of Siegel, the rush of orchestrating deals that spanned state lines. In exile, those memories played like films he could never fully step back into. He had power once, but power needs proximity. Influence needs presence. And exile robbed him of both. Yet, even stripped of command, Luciano remained a figure of fascination. Tourists sought him out. Young gangsters treated him like a myth made flesh. Journalists hovered around him, hoping for quotes from the man who once ruled New York. They wanted insight, confession, scandal, anything that would rekindle the legend of Lucky Luciano. But he rarely gave them what they wanted. If prison had taught him restraint, exile taught him silence. The truth was more complex than any headline. Luciano was torn between pride and regret. He admired the structure he had created, the modernized mafia that now operated smoothly without constant bloodshed. But he felt a growing ache that came from irrelevance, a sensation more painful than any prison sentence. He watched the younger generation of mobsters rise, forging new alliances, controlling new industries, expanding into drugs and casinos with an efficiency he once pioneered. Some came to him for advice, but many simply moved past his legacy, intent on building their own. His attempt to re-enter power through the narcotics trade only deepened his struggles. While he never controlled drug networks as prosecutors once claimed, he understood that narcotics were becoming the underworld's future. But American bosses were cautious about associating with a deported man under heavy police surveillance. Italian authorities kept him under near constant watch, fearing the globalization of crime. Luciano found himself trapped between two continents, too famous to operate freely and too isolated to exert meaningful influence. As the years passed, a subtle transformation occurred. Luciano became reflective. He thought more about his youth, about the choices that carved his path, about the irony of being both celebrated and punished for the systems he built. He acknowledged that his brilliance often came paired with ruthlessness, that the power he commanded brought both order and destruction. And he faced the bittersweet truth that the world rarely remembers the man, only the myth he becomes. But Luciano's story did not end in obscurity. In his final years, he forged a strange peace with his circumstances. He embraced the role of an elder statesman of crime, offering guidance when asked, observing the evolution of the syndicate from afar. He lived quietly in Naples, his days filled with routine, his nights with memories. The empire still echoed with his influence, even if it no longer bore his name. On the day he died, collapsing at the Naples airport after meeting with a filmmaker planning a movie about his life, there was a poetic symmetry in the moment. He had lived long enough to see himself become a legend, and he died in the act of watching that legend take shape. His heart stopped before he could step into the car waiting outside, as if fate had chosen that moment to lower the curtain on a man whose life had been defined by reinvention. Exile did not erase Lucky Luciano. It humanized him. It revealed the loneliness behind the power, the weight behind the decisions, the price behind the rise. It showed that even the architect of a criminal empire could not escape the boundaries of his own creation. He left the world not as the Kingpin who ruled New York, but as a man suspended between two identities, Salvatore Lucania of Sicily and Lucky Luciano of America. A man who built a system strong enough to survive without him. A man whose legacy would outlive the borders that once confined him. And a man who, even in exile, remained unforgettable. Legacy is never a clean thing. It is a mosaic of contradictions, brilliance and brutality, innovation and destruction, admiration and fear. Lucky Luciano's legacy is exactly that, a complex, shifting portrait of a man who reshaped the American underworld and in doing so, influenced systems far beyond crime itself. To understand the impact he left behind, one must step back from the myths, the headlines, the glamorous depictions in films and novels, and see the architecture of the world he helped build. Luciano did not invent organized crime in America. Crime existed in 1,000 shapes long before he arrived. But he organized it, refined it, structured it, and gave it a framework capable of outliving any single man. His creation, the Commission, was more than a criminal council. It was a governing body. It introduced balance, diplomacy, and cooperation into a world previously ruled by impulse and vendetta. Under Luciano's blueprint, conflicts were resolved not through endless street warfare but through negotiation, votes, and profit-sharing arrangements. This shift alone changed the nature of American crime for generations. The influence extended into the public and political realms. Law enforcement, once scattered and reactive, was forced to evolve. Prosecutors began building long-term, intelligence-based cases. Federal agencies started working across state lines. Politicians who once dismissed organized crime as a myth were now compelled to recognize its structure and reach. In this way, Luciano shaped the very institutions that pursued him. By organizing the criminals, he inadvertently organized the pursuit of criminals. His impact on criminal psychology was equally profound. Luciano understood that fear was a blunt tool, useful but limited. He taught the underworld the value of subtlety, of influence instead of intimidation, partnership instead of domination. Modern criminal enterprises, from street-level gangs to global cartels, still reflect elements of this mindset. The idea of distributed power, shared responsibility, and strategic alliances began with him. Even corporations in their own legal spheres followed similar principles. Networks instead of hierarchies, cooperation instead of monopolistic aggression. Yet Luciano's legacy is also shadowed by darkness. The structure he created made organized crime more efficient, more profitable, and more resilient. Violence decreased but exploitation did not. Lives were ruined by narcotics, unions were manipulated, legitimate industries were corrupted, and communities were shaped, often unwillingly, by the invisible hand of syndicates that owed their existence to his innovations. Luciano's genius did not discriminate between good and harm. It simply sought order. And order can be used for anything. His personal legacy, too, is full of contradictions. To some, he was a visionary, a man ahead of his time who brought intelligence to an industry fueled by bloodshed. To others, he was a criminal mastermind responsible for systemic suffering. To the media, he was both, a perfect blend of villain and icon, the kind of figure whose myth grows larger with every retelling. He became a symbol not just of Mafia power, but of American fascination with the outlaw archetype. Even within the Mafia, opinions about him diverged. Older bosses saw him as a traitor to Sicilian traditions. Younger ones saw him as the architect of their careers. Some believe he saved the Mafia from self-destruction. Others argue he set it on a path toward greed-driven corruption that eventually attracted too much attention from the government. Regardless of interpretation, his impact was undeniable. No mobster after him, no matter how feared or powerful, operated outside the structure he created. But perhaps the most profound element of Luciano's legacy lies in the paradox of his later life. He built a system designed to survive without him, and it did. When he was imprisoned, the Mafia continued. When he was exiled, the operations expanded. When he died, the Commission still stood. In a sense, Luciano achieved a dream most leaders never reach. He created an empire strong enough to outgrow its creator. And yet, this achievement carried a quiet tragedy. He lived to see himself become obsolete. He watched from afar as younger men he once advised rose through the ranks, as new criminal markets opened, as alliances formed without his input. The very strength of his system ensured his irrelevance. It was both his triumph and his punishment. Even outside the underworld, Luciano's name lingered like a cultural echo. Hollywood adapted his life into characters. Writers modeled crime bosses after his tactics. Academics studied the structure he created as a blueprint for understanding secret organizations. His story became a cautionary tale, a strategic lesson, a psychological study. He showed that power, when structured properly, does not depend on one man. But he also showed that power always extracts a price, from victims, from followers, and eventually from the one who wields it. In the end, Luciano's legacy is not about the crimes he committed or the empire he built. It is about the mindset he introduced into the American underworld, the idea that chaos can be shaped, that criminals can operate with the precision of businessmen, and that influence can be exerted without ever raising a gun. His was a legacy of method, a legacy of systems, strategies, and psychology. He left behind a world forever changed by his vision. A world more dangerous in some ways, more disciplined in others, and infinitely more complex. His fingerprints remain on the history of organized crime, on law enforcement methodologies, on popular culture, and on the collective imagination of anyone fascinated by power and its consequences. Lucky Luciano did not just build the American Mafia. He built a blueprint for how power can be organized, controlled, and weaponized. And long after his death, that blueprint continues to shape the shadows.